Hello everyone, this is the Theoretical Doctor and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. This is a series on the chapter Transport in Animals and Plants of Chapter 8 of the STPM Semester 2 Biology series. Check out the full playlist on my channel. If you want access to flashcards on this topic and other videos, do click the link below. It is available on my website as well as slides on this topic. In this video, we will be continuing on the water transport in the roots of plants. In this video, the subtopics we will be touching on would be the absorption and transport of minerals in plants, as well as the three different pathways of water transport in the roots of plants, which are Apoplast, Symplast, and Vacuolar pathway. Absorption and transport of minerals in plants, or in other words, the inorganic ions. So in young plants, the water and mineral ions are absorbed directly into the roots, but in older plants, they rely on the root hairs because the roots are less permeable to water. This is due to the suberized exodermis. So there are two ways on how water is being taken up into the plant. The first is through the passive intake, whereby no energy is required, and the next is through active intake, whereby energy or ATP is required. In passive intake, inorganic ions or minerals are absorbed into root hairs from the soil by diffusion, and they are dissolved into the water surrounding the soil particles to form the soil solution. So after they're diffused inside there, diffused into the water, the concentration of the inorganic ions in the soil solution is higher than that found in the cell sap of the root hairs. So first, the minerals are absorbed through the root hairs by diffusion. They're dissolved into the water. They form the solution. Next is active intake. Energy or ATP is required as inorganic ions are actively transported into the root hairs against the concentration gradient with the help of specific transmembrane transport proteins. So in active intake, energy is required because they are needed to move against the concentration gradient, whereas in passive intake, they move down the concentration gradient, so no energy is required. Through this passive and active intake, once they have been absorbed by the root hairs, these minerals are dissolved in the water and carried by mass flow across the cortex either by Apoplast, Symplast, or Vacuolar pathway. And we will talk more about this. So in terms of the water transport in the plants, there are three pathways, and in order for these minerals to be absorbed and transported throughout the plants, they require the water pathway. That's why they need to be absorbed and they need to be dissolved into the water first, and from there they're being transported all over the plant. So water transport in roots of plants. Water and mineral ions are absorbed by young roots or root hairs by osmosis as a result of the water potential gradient. The large number of fine root hairs with thin walls provide a large surface area over volume ratio, thus increasing the rate of absorption of water and minerals. Dilute soil solution contains higher water potential. When there is higher water potential, the cell sap in the vacuole of the root hair has a lower or more negative water potential due to the high concentration of solutes present. Water from dilute soil solution diffuses by osmosis down the water potential gradient through the partially permeable plasma membrane into the cytoplasm and cell sap in the vacuole of the root hair cell. The entry of water increases the water potential of the cell. So water moves from an area of higher water potential to an area of lower water potential. That's why it moves from the dilute soil solution into the cytoplasm and cell sap of the root hair cell. And in this case, no energy is required. The neighboring cortex cell has a lower water potential. Water is drawn in by osmosis from root hair cell with a higher water potential into the neighboring cortex cell with a lower water potential. And the water then moves from cell to cell in the cortex of the root down a water potential gradient. So I know there's a lot of water potential word being said over here, but basically what you need to remember is that water will move from an area of high water potential to an area of low water potential, and the area which has high water potential is in the soil solution surrounding the roots. Now in the root hair cell, there is low water potential. So since water moves from a high water potential to a low water potential, the water will move from the soil solution around the root hair cells and into the root hair cells. From there, it will go through the three different pathways which I mentioned earlier, which are the Apoplast, Symplast and Vacuolar pathway. First off, the Apoplast pathway. Apoplast pathway is where water can freely diffuse through the small spaces between the root cells and through pores in the cellulose cell walls. Now, it only works when the water potential gradient down which the water will diffuse does not involve water entering the cell. The water potential of the root cells is always more negative than the soil solution, and water is drawn in through this pathway by the effects of the transpirational stream. Now, regarding the transpirational stream, I'll talk about in the next video. However, upon reaching the endodermis cells, water is forced to move from the apoplast pathway into the cytoplasm of the cells. So why is this? Is because the movement of water is prevented by the waterproof suberin of the Casperin strip, which completely encircles each endodermis cell. So in this way, water entering the xylem can be controlled, and once it enters the xylem, the water does not leak out easily. So in apoplast pathway, it's important to remember where the water moves, because in these three different pathways, the pathways of the water movement through the plant through the xylem is different. So water and mineral ions enter into the cell wall and moves through the spaces between the cellulose fibers in the cell wall. As you can see over here, this orange one is the apoplast pathway. The blue one is the Symplast pathway, which I will talk about in the next part. Just focus on the orange one first. So this is the apoplast pathway. It moves through the cell wall. Water may move directly from cell wall of one cell, which is over here, to the cell wall of another cell over here through the intercellular spaces. This is the intercellular spaces, this one. So from one cell wall of one cell to the next through the intercellular spaces. The cohesive forces between the water molecules enable the stream of water and dissolved mineral ions to be pulled along the apoplast pathway through the mass flow. Next is the Symplast and the Vacuolar pathway. First, the Symplast pathway. Symplast pathway is where water is able to move quickly across the root through pores called plasmodesmata, which links the cytoplasms of the adjacent cortical cells. So this part here, this is the plasmodesmata. This one is the Symplast pathway. In this pathway, water also moves down the water potential gradient. Water diffuses through the cell wall and then from the cytoplasm of one cell to the cytoplasm of the adjacent cell. So you can see over here, this is the Symplast pathway. It moves through the cytoplasm, okay, through the plasmodesmata. In the apoplast pathway, it moves through the cell wall. In the Symplast pathway, it is through the cytoplasm. So the Symplast pathway allows the direct flow of some mineral ions from one cell to the adjacent cell through the plasmodesmata. The third pathway is the Vacuolar pathway. It is where water is transported by osmosis from one vacuole of one cell to the vacuole of another cell through the cell wall, the cell membrane, and the cytoplasm. So it moves from one vacuole of one cell to the next vacuole of another cell. So why through the cell wall, cell membrane, and cytoplasm? Because it needs to cross through the cell wall, the cell membrane, and as well as the cytoplasm. That's how it's able to exit the cell and enter into the next cell and finally into the vacuole again. So in this pathway, water is transported at a slower rate. Yes, it's slower because it needs to cross through so many barriers than through the cell membrane and is dependent on the water potential gradient. This is just a summary of all the three different pathways. All of it follows the water potential gradient from an area of higher water potential gradient to an area of lower water potential gradient. And all of this pathway, the Vacuolar, Apoplast, and Symplast, does not require energy, does not require ATP. In the Apoplast pathway, water freely diffuses through the small spaces between the root cells and directly from cell wall to cell wall of another cell. So this part here is the Apoplast pathway. In Symplast pathway, water moves from cytoplasm to the cytoplasm of another cell through the plasmodesmata. So this one here is the Symplast pathway. And finally, in the Vacuolar pathway, water moves from one vacuole to another vacuole of another cell through the cell wall, cell membrane, and cytoplasm. And this one is a rather slow movement. So this one here is the Vacuolar pathway. If you've reached this point, thank you very much. Hit the like button if you found it helpful, as it does help in reaching out to others as well. Please support my channel by pressing the subscribe button so I will know, and it gives me motivation to continue producing content like this in the future. And finally, share this video to those who might find this helpful. I'll see you in the next one.